So just as we did with anxiety, the big question is now that we've identified what actually happens in mood disorders, one, how do you explain it? And then secondly, how do you treat it? Which has everything to do with how you explain it, obviously. So the first one is, let's just talk about understanding mood disorders first. And there are, again, as there was with anxiety, there are a number of different theories in terms of how we understand them. The first one, and actually it's articulated more by in a generalized sort of way. Peter Lewinson is mentioned in your book and his colleagues, and they've suggested that any theory of depression must explain the multitude of behavioral and cognitive changes, how widespread it is amongst people, why women are more vulnerable to depression than men are, the tendency for depressive episodes to actually stop, remit, or self-terminate, and the link between stressful events and the onset of depression itself. So the first one is biological, the biological perspective. And again, I think what you can imagine is that we are slow moving consistently toward more of a biopsychosocial approach, but we'll split these out a little bit for you so that you can understand them a little bit more clearly. So essentially, as the name suggests, the biological perspective emphasizes the importance of genetics, neural and biochemical influences. And most of the research has identified some fairly significant things related to depression that occur in each of these areas. For example, oftentimes we see what oftentimes is referred to as the linkage analysis, where mood disorders tend to run in families. So if a parent is identified as having a mood disorder, depression, or whatever, oftentimes you see the kids having very similar difficulties. The linkage analysis that I mentioned a minute ago is being used to search for genes that might actually put people at risk. On the neurological level, the brains of depressed people have been found to be less active in particular areas, less active. Like I said, in specific areas, the left frontal lobe, for example, which, if you remember, the frontal lobe has a lot to do with decision making. So the left frontal lobe and the adjacent brain reward area, which are typically active during positive emotional experiences, tend to be less active during depressed states. The other one, which is a subcomponent of this, is the hippocampus, which has been part of the limbic system. And of course, when we're talking about a mood disorder, then we probably can suggest that the limbic system is somehow involved. And the hippocampus is that memory processing center that's linked into the emotional circuitry. What we found is that it's very vulnerable to stress-related damage. So the more stressed out the person is, the more oftentimes we see a proneness, which would explain some of the vulnerability to stress-related onset, stress-related damage itself. And that's why we see the difficulties that people might have having their depression actually triggered by a stressful event. Finally, the other element of this biological perspective is neurotransmitters, and this is probably one of the more significant areas that we have found more and more out about. And the key neurotransmitters involved in mood regulation and just elevation of mood, so regulation and elevation, are norepinephrine, I'll just put NE, and serotonin. And the other one, which can be mentioned, although it's not specifically mentioned, is dopamine. So these three, oftentimes when you look at the various medications, which are a biological treatment of the disorder, you will find them targeting these particular neurotransmitters. Now the second one is a social cognitive perspective, and again, it doesn't deny the biological, but it puts a whole lot more emphasis on the cognitive component, if you will. So essentially, it suggests that depression results from self-defeating beliefs, which arise from learned helplessness. We talked a little bit about that with the dog that was in a cage that was electrified and finally gave up and just kind of quit, and a negative explanatory style. So what that means is that it's pessimism on steroids. It might be one way to put it, a negative explanatory style. So and the thing to keep in mind, particularly in depression, is the thing that we've referred back to, or we've talked before about, is the confirmation bias. Is that if I see myself as incapable, helpless, unable to do anything, I can't do anything right, then these belief systems have a direct impact on what happens, essentially. And so what happens with depressed people is they take bad events, and in terms of three different component parts: the globalness of them, the stability of them, and then external versus internal aspects of them, so internal. And so this perspective sees the disorder as this vicious cycle in which negative, stressful events are interpreted through a pessimistic explanatory style. It happens because I'm inadequate or I'm inept, creating the hopeless, depressed state, and that hampers the way the person thinks and behaves, and of course, it in turn fuels a negative, stressful experience, such as rejection. So you have this vicious cycle, if you will, that occurs in depression that's related to the social cognitive component, that starts out as a negative perspective that then leads essentially to, and I'll just put perspective, the negative perspective, which then leads to a pessimism, that then leads to hopelessness. I'll just put hopeless here. That then essentially leads to ineffective actions. Effective actions. Which then goes back to and perpetuates a negative perspective. So it's a vicious cycle that really comes into play with the social cognitive perspective. The reality is that this perspective really holds sway. Remember, in the anxiety, we talked that the biological perspective or the learning perspective was the one that really is the treatment of choice. In depression, the cognitive, and again, CBT crops up again, but the cognitive perspective is the one that has had the greatest impact on treating depression.